It's always fun for me to see what name comes up from DNS for my computer.
What does it say today?
It says Taurus Air, something, 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 something.
Yeah.
So it's all based off DHCP and DNS registration. So yeah, it's just kind of funny. Okay, that's not the name of my MacBook. Is that? We'll go bigger. Maybe not that big. Okay. Today, I want to talk a little. I want to start talking about AJAX. So AJAX is an internet terminology. Does anybody know what it stands for?
Basic JavaScript Next.
Correct. And guess what? Nobody uses XML anymore. I wish we could call it AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and JSON, because that's the way almost everything works anymore. So the XML part is no longer really used. Anybody know where it came from? Yeah, but I mean, like, who did it first? Surprisingly, this is an Internet Explorer and Microsoft invention. Everyone likes to rag on Microsoft, but a surprising number of web technologies came from them first, even in more recent memory. So AJAX came from the precursor to Outlook in Office 365. So it was called Outlook Web Access. It wasn't cloud hosted, you hosted it yourself, but it had AJAX in there, one of the first places to do that. So they pioneered that technology. When you first started using it, you had to make requests using a ActiveX object, which is, Internet Explorer Only, and it became adopted as a browser standard based off that. So again, most people don't realize that, but I mean that's where we got there from. Okay. So AJAX is what powers a modern web app. Particularly, like, we wouldn't be able to do really much interesting with a single page web application without AJAX. Because the core tenet of single page web applications is, as I click around, it makes requests, lightweight requests to the server for API calls, returns some object, and based off that object, I change the HTML on the page, right? So as opposed to a full page load, the browser would make a full new request to the server, be given HTML, and then request all the images and everything. And that causes kind of a, it's normal browsing, as you say, you click around, but it's not quite as snappy or as nice feeling as those single page applications can get. And so those are powered by AJAX and remote API calls within the browser. So originally, this part is just so you can understand kind of what we had to do, and then we're gonna jump straight into the new way to do it with Fetch. Okay, so I just want you to see this. You're not going to be required to know that. So originally we used the XML HTTP request object. So we would do const new XML HTTP request, and then we do xhr.open. Now, open is not what you think, right? This is set up the connection, not actually go do the call. So terminology here. And so the method. Now, we haven't talked about this, but you can see it in your browser log. An HTTP request has methods: get, post, put, delete, head, options. These are all HTTP verbs and methods. And so you have to tell it which one you're using. Normal internet browser, just in HTML, does two: get and post. Those are the only ones you can do within HTML from a browser. And those are pretty much the normal ones you're using until we get to REST and some other things. But so you have to tell it the method, and it's a string. So get, that's what I'm going to use by default. And then the URL we're requesting. So let me go find. Let me go find my URL. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I like to use one of the Missouri State ones that I wrote. So let's watch it go. Fonts. There it is. So we're going to get the Missouri State calendar because it is API enabled. And so let's not worry too much about what the URLs are. Do I really want JSON in script? Sorry, let me try to remember all the options. And then the last option on this method is whether to make this asynchronous or synchronous. So originally we could do a synchronous call. Now, as a programmer, everyone prefers the synchronous calls, right? I can just, write my statements in logical order and not have to think about asynchronous methods. This is really bad in a web browser because JavaScript in a web browser, except for when we talk about service workers and web workers, is single-threaded. So when you block for an API call, you block the UI. Spinner, can't click, can't do anything. Bad, bad, bad. Don't do this. So we don't want to block the UI. And so everything we should do, we should always be opting into asynchronous. In fact, if you try to do this synchronous, the browser will warn you this is deprecated in the main thread. We may remove this at any time in the future, blah, blah, blah. Don't do it. So async is the default, but I'm going to explicitly say true because I want it to be async, okay? So open it again. See more of this. I don't want to actually do anything with that. And let's see what this is going to return to me. Make sure this is going to return the right thing. So this is actually going to return XML by default. I don't want XML. There we go. So I want a JSON return result. So again, the query string parameters aren't like an internet standard or anything. This is just what we used at Missouri State to get there. So don't memorize and expect you can do this anywhere. It wouldn't need to be documented if that was the case. But in this case, I can put alt equal JSON and I'm going to group JSON return result. Okay, so at this point, I can actually fire this off and send it by calling send. And that will actually cause the browser to initiate a network request, right? Okay. How do I get a response? See, we get a little bit of a problem here. Since this is an asynchronous, I can do this with an event listener. Add event listener. Oh, man. I don't do this enough to remember. Make this browser bigger. MDN XML HTTP request. Is it ready state change? Yep. And you notice they talked about doing this as a property assignment, which I could do that, but I want to actually do this as an event listener. So we'll just say ready state change. Event. And remember, capture bubble doesn't matter here. We don't really have a capture or bubble phase, but I'll just say false because that's the default, right, that we use. So it'll be in the bubble phase, but this isn't in the DOM, so it doesn't even really make sense. So, but here we go. So this is where I'm going to get data. Now, keep in mind, I'm in an asynchronous callback right now, right? So send is going to fire before my callback, even though it logically comes first. So what am I going to do here? Now, up until this point, just for class, I've been using things like document.write to just write out content, right? If I did this now, does anybody know what would happen if I did that in the callback? So when your document is first rendered, you can use document.write to write out additional content. Not considered a best practice, by the way, but you can do it. That's what I've been doing in class. But once the document completes, like your HTML is loaded and gets parsed, if I use document.write, it overwrites everything in the browser. So I don't want that here. Let's find document.get elements by tag name body. Remember, elements is a key to me that it returned a list of items, even though I know there's only should be one thing in it. So I'll just take the first one. And then let's write inner text equals. So great. What am I going to put there? Let me go look at my documentation again so I don't get this wrong. Response text. So let's just write out the response text. So I could do event.currentTarget, which is going to be the thing I attach the event listener to, .response. Let me wrap that. So I could do that. But in this case, let's just make it very clear what we're talking about. I already have a handle to it, so I'll just say xhr.responseText. I mean, that's what we want. It was the response text that was on the XHR object itself. But turns out this ready state event change gets called a lot. And so I don't want, it's going to be called more than once every time the state changes. So let's go look at those options. So it's initially going to be unsent, right? Because I haven't called send yet. It's immediately going to be called opened as soon as I hit send. It's going to be get headers received. It's going to get loading, and then it's going to get done. So, and notice that I've got funky, like, I just have to use the magic numbers. Not a great idea, but guess what? That's what I get to use. So let's say if xhr.readystate not equal 4, console.log xhr.readystate return. Okay, so if I'm not done, you know, just log out where I am so I can see that it's being called. You wouldn't do that in prod. You would just say, if it's not done, do this, and then log out what's going on, right? So this generally makes sense. Everyone's got it. One thing to note, if you're in an HTTPS web page, remember we set up Webpack to run HTTPS locally, and you try to call an HTTP API, the browser may start blocking that content because you're trying to load insecure content from a secure context. So it's always better to make sure you're at least upgrading your request. So from HTTP, you can call HTTPS. That's okay, but the other way around, not so much. So we just try to keep everything on HTTPS. All right, so there we go. We're making a request and we're doing something with it. Make sure everything's still set up locally. Now let's see how wrong I got this. Oh, it worked. Okay, so I was able to get that. But, I mean, this is all gobbledygook. Let's deal with this better in a minute. So, at this point, though, I got a string, right? Not really useful to me. I want a structured object. And this response is JSON, not XML. So if I wanted this JSON, so let's say, let's just call our variable data equals JSON.parse. Now, there is another method in JavaScript that you can use to do this called eval. Eval is evil, do not use it. Remember, it re-invokes the parser. So it would do way more than just JSON in there. I could put JavaScript to actually execute and run arbitrary code. Really dangerous. Don't use eval. In fact, you should just try to never use eval. There are some valid use cases, but avoid them. Yes?
If we had like our own class, we would like unravel your JSON into parts to do that.
So what you would do to that is you would use JSON.parse, which is going to create you an anonymous object. And let's go over here and look. So this has an object called version, and then one called feed. Okay. Link, 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 link. Is it events? There's the array. I'm trying to find. Well, oh, entry. It's called entry. So what if instead of this, we said data.feed.entry.length? So that should tell us the number of events we got back. Let's save that. 15. Great. Now, but let's actually, I mean, I could hack around at this and just keep writing out data, but I want to show you something interesting and see what we're getting back. So let's go put debugger here. Boom. Okay. So this is where dev tools become really handy. I'm going to make this really big so I can see it. So if I hover over my data object, or I can actually, I can see the object I have, and I can go down. So if I had a class, let's say I'm in a class that represented a single event, because this is the list from the Missouri State Calendar of Events. So if I had a class that represented a single event, you know, if I go data.event, sorry, it's data.feed.event 0. Oh, it's entry. If I were to go type of, that's just object, right? Nothing useful. It definitely wouldn't be an instance of my class. There's no auto magic deserialization from here over here. So what I would need to do is I either would need a constructor on that class that took in one of these objects with these properties. Now, you all don't study strong classes anymore because there's no Java, but what this would be from a strongly typed language is we would be talking about this object would implement an interface. It's not actually an instance of it, but it has all the properties and all the types that I expect, right? So you would be able to pass in any object that implements this interface and construct a class from it. And you would manually set it up by saying this dot this equal, you know, you just manually assign the variables over. So that'd be what I do, or I could just manually say new class and then set all the properties myself. But that's how you would have to get it over there. But you could do that, or you could just use the object as it exists now. So here we go. We have this object, and then we can do fun things with it. We can look at the entry. Oh, I don't want type of. So we can poke around here and see. I can see I have an author, which is itself an array, so I can have more than one author on an event. And I expand it up, and it has an email object with a $T property that says the actual email address, and same for name. So this is kind of, I can kind of see where I'm getting at. A category, so I can see that these have public, alumni, current students. I can see what categories this is part of. Content, I can see that I have HTML and it's encoded, right? Okay. Anything else in here? Oh, here's a title down here. Here's a summary of the event, published, when the event occurs, where it occurs. So I can see kind of how that object works, right? And so ideally, there would be a site that we could go to that would provide strong documentation that says this is the object and these are the types that it's getting. Great API has this. This API wasn't really designed to be publicly consumed. Doesn't have this, but doesn't mean you can't use it. We just have to poke around and kind of figure it out on our own. The other thing is you notice that this API, I changed parameters. This is a conversion from XML. So it just automatically converted from XML to JSON, which is why you see funky things like $T in there. But it allows us to provide the same data in multiple formats and not have to maintain different outputs, right? You can just say, write it as JSON or write it as XML. And then fully available to whoever needs to consume. Back when this was first written, RSS was a big deal. And so being able to provide an XML feed, no one talks about RSS anymore. In fact, you may not even know what that is. It was a way to, instead of having to go to a blog, I could just pull in their newsfeed into a reader, kind of like an email client, and just read it. But no ads showed that way, right? And so RSS kind of died. So we don't do that anymore. So like I said, XML is just rarely used anymore. Definitely not really in a web browser, if you can all help it. JSON.parse is just really easy to parse, easy to work with, and so that's where we go. Questions on this? This was old method, not the way you're going to want to do it, right? Okay. Let's go talk about new method. So that was all the code I had to write. It was effective, but it was not fun to work with, right? You watch me, who does this all the time, going to have to look at documentation, things like that. I may have to do that here too, but no promises. So instead of creating a new object, there's a new object called fetch. And fetch, by default, is going to be get. So I can provide a request object and change it to something else. But if I don't specify anything, if I just give it a string, it's going to be a get request, right? So by default, I can say fetch. And so that's going to go out there and get it. And it's always asynchronous. I have no other option, right? There we go. So fetching this. And it returns a promise. And we're going to talk about promises in depth next week about asynchronous in JavaScript. But at a, I think it returns a promise. It definitely returns a promise, but let me look and make sure. Using fetch. Yeah, it is. So promises have our thing reduced a concept called a thenable, which is a funky way of saying it returns an object that has a then method. So after this thing is done, call the then callback, right? That's the way you can think about this. We're going to talk about in depth more. And it takes itself a function, and that function takes one argument. It only takes one. And that is whatever the data it's returning. So I'm going to call this response. Remember, it's an argument. I can call it whatever I want. But the thing coming back is the response from the request, right? So let's just stop right there. And see what happens. Woohoo! So there we go. So I console.logged it, which is a great way to just explore something, and we can come over and see. Okay, so I've got a response object. Yay. But the fetch, again, I've got a body as a readable stream. So what in the heck am I going to do with this? Well, one kind of side note, while the common and easy way when you're writing a web server is to write out a string back as a single block, right? That's not sustainable because that block has to be kept in memory and sent over. And you may not think that's a big deal, except imagine sending a 1 gig file, all right? That takes a minimum of 1 gig of RAM on the web server for one request. So if you knew a web server doing that and you made 100 requests to it at the same time, what's gonna happen? Right? So we don't do this, right? Once a request, once the amount of content we're going to send is going to be considered large, whatever you want to define that as, maybe that's a meg. You want to switch to streaming. So it's going to write out this not as one big single TCP set of data sent down. I mean, it always gets divided up into packets, but instead of setting out, so the web server is going to read a set of data. It uses a buffer. So let's say it reads 60K of data, and it's going to write 60K of data. It's going to wipe its memory and read 60K more, write 60K more, read 60K more, write. So it's a stream of data going out. And Fetch is designed to consume streams because that's the great paradigm to use. So I've got a stream here, so what do I use it? Well, Fetch has a handy method called .toJSON, which is going to read the stream and parse it as it goes to JSON and give me a JSON object back, which is what I wanted, right? Was it lowercase? Oh, it was just .json. Okay, so, and I want to return that. So if I'm not logging, not returning, everyone remembers the shortcut we can do with arrow functions, right? Instead of a block that returns a single thing, we can just have a single statement in there, no semicolon, no braces, and that's the thing that got returned, right? Okay. So it turns out the JSON method returns another promise. So we can chain it again. We'll talk more about promises next week. So now my next function should have my data object already parsed. Boom. So console, oh, look, there's my object. And it's an object you can see because I can click around everything. So already, all this code that I wrote up here. Oh, wait. Let's actually do this part too. Let's get rid of, just to illustrate how much more efficient and nicer to use this is. 15 events, right? So everything I wrote up here, old style of doing things, new object, open, send, event to listeners. I can now just do this right here. Much easier to work with. Asynchronous by default. And there's some other great advantages we're going to learn about later. Yes?
Is that second that necessary?
It is necessary, and this is the correct way to do it. But you would think of it more like this. We're going to talk about the whys next week, but what I could have done is, instead of returning this, I could have done that. Okay?
The other way is
So we're going to talk more about this. Why is the other way easier to read? Yeah, I'm asking.
because you can barely see.
Yeah, but imagine, right, what would happen if in here I needed to do another .then. So you're going to keep getting this, and this actually has a name called callback hell. And you can see it because your code starts getting this indentation like thing going on, and you start going in there. Also, what happens if I needed to have a wait on the response of 2 callbacks, right? I need both things to have completed before I continue, right? That starts getting hard, right? So you start thinking through the problem. How am I going to do that? We'll talk about that next week, but there is ways to do it. So that's why it is more, anytime you're dealing with promises, trying to keep the .thens on the same level as what you want to do. So just so you understand, this response.json returned a promise. And so the next then finishes when this JSON completes, right? So it's just, so it does the exact same thing as what I had, but it avoids the indentation that leads to that arrow shaped to the right kind of code pattern that we want to avoid. Not more performant, nothing like that. It's just easier to maintain, easier to read once you understand what's going on. All right, so you can see this is definitely the way to go, much easier to work with, okay? Now, Fetch is the new kid on the block, but it was released prematurely. I think the latest spec and probably the latest browsers have addressed this, but one thing, let's say you're going to request something, and on occasion it takes more than 30 seconds to respond, right? It's an eternity on a web page, right? It's a really long API call. So maybe you just think something's going on and I want to cancel this request and try again. Well, up until recently, there's no way to cancel a fetch. You could ignore the response, but the browser still got that open connection. The data is still going to be transferred. It's all still going to be happening, right? Well, so up here with add event listener, with the XHR object, one thing I could have said is xhr.timeout equals 30 times 1,000, so 30 seconds. In milliseconds. So I could have said 30 seconds, automatically timeout, and I can have XHR to add event listener error, or is it cancel? There's an error event for network. I think there's a cancel event. So you could actually handle and do different things. So that made, well, it's not fun to work with all the event listeners. It provided a nice interface to do all of these things. Really powerful, right? Turns out the vast majority of you don't need to cancel a fetch request, right? So you don't need some of that power. So don't worry about that so much. For those of you who have to be concerned with older web browsers, aka Internet Explorer, which does not support fetch yet, there are polyfill libraries that give you a fetch interface but use the XML HTTP request under the hood. So you can just switch over to, you can write and program in fetch, and you can basically say, you can have JavaScript, it says, if fetch not in window, add this JavaScript, right? And so you can load this polyfill just for browsers that don't need it, and then you can just program with fetch and not have to worry about it. The wonderful thing of modern browser web programming, so. All right. Any questions on fetch or calling an API? How that might work. Hopefully this is not the first time you've seen something like this. Yes?
So you said it's a get request by default.
So I always have to go look at the documentation. Don't feel bad about doing that. No one. Constructor. So the fetch constructor can take a couple things. It can take a string or it can take a request object. So I could go construct a request object that says, use these headers, use this, okay? Not fun. The other thing is, it can also take an optional second parameter that's your initialization. That's probably what I would do here. If we were in a service worker, that answer would be different, by the way, but we are not talking about service workers yet. So I could say method, yeah, I can change that to post. And so I can add headers. If I need to send a body, so perhaps I'm writing a web app and I have a login form and I want to send the username and password to the server, right? So I need to send data, right? So that would be the body, the request body. You can send data on the URL with a get without a body, you know, it's just question mark. You've seen those parameters. But sometimes you want to send it as a form post body. So you can put that as a body. We'll skip credentials for the moment. So, you know, all of these options you can just add there to fetch and change the method. So that's what I would use. It's much easier to look at your URL as a string like that and not construct a request object unless you're in a service worker. That's a separate thing. Questions on this? Everyone feel comfortable with this concept, seen it before, willing to do it? Okay. So homework will be using the API I just had. I'll provide you the base URL and kind of document a few of the parameters, and we'll be dealing with that. So you'll be using fetch to do this. You can use XML HTTP request if you want. I would ask that you not use a library. So don't go grab jQuery and use the AJAX function, right? The point of this is for you to understand how this technology works in the browser. So it doesn't mean you have to use this forever. Doesn't mean you have to use this the rest of the class. But for this homework assignment, I want you to use either a fetch or XML HTTP request, whichever you're more familiar with or comfortable with to do that. So. All right, thanks. Lab Friday, I'll have homework assignment assigned by then. No class on Monday. We'll be back in here on Wednesday.